All right. I believe we are recording, so let's go ahead and get started. You are all very welcome. Today's topic is equitable compensation, and we are introducing the Equitable Compensation Playbook, which has been a long time in the making. And so we're all very excited to be able to share it with you and to answer any questions that you have and to think and talk about the possibilities of the realities that you are all facing as you think about what equitable compensation and fair pay means to you. And so for the next hour and a half, that's what we are going to be doing. You are all very welcome. My name is Kim Kaczynskis. I'm the Director of Organizational Transformation at Humentum. I have a number of colleagues on the call that will be joining the conversation in a moment, and we'll be introducing them as we go. But I wanted to just get us started for the first few minutes to be thinking about the topic at hand. So as a representative of Humentum, I'm also going to just drop in to the chat some information that most of you probably know already because you found us. So you know what all of the different events are that we have going on, but there may be other events that are of interest to you, including, for example, our People and Culture Roundtable, where we are always talking about topics like compensation because they come up. They are important. What we'll be doing for the next hour and a half is I will be doing a brief overview of the compensation playbook and the tool in and of itself. And then we will open it up to a discussion with some of the creators of the playbook to kind of talk a little bit about how it came to be, what the struggles were, what the hopes, and what the potential utilization of the playbook could look like. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So feel free to put your questions, comments, thoughts in the chat at any moment as they come up, but we'll also save time for questions and answers towards the end. But I first wanted to get started with asking you all what you think about the topic of equitable compensation. And so in true Humentum spirit, we are going to be starting with a poll. This is a very low effort, low bar way to participate. And so I'm going to put a link in the chat. I'm going to ask you to go to Menti poll. You can either click on the link in the chat, or you can open up a browser or pull out your phone and go to menti.com and then go to 2264476. And I will share my screen so we can see. And the first question that we have here is, do you have a shared definition of equitable compensation within your organization? Is it something that you have? Now we can talk about, there's a difference between do you have it and do others know about it? And do you use it consistently in practice? But I think the first question is, do you have it? And as answers are rolling in, we can see that more organizations than not do not have a shared definition. And that's not unusual, I don't think. We'll hear back from Ishbil in a bit what most organizations do, but I don't think that that's unusual. So let's just give it a minute. Do you have a shared definition of equitable compensation? And it's quite all right if you don't know. That's okay too. All right, last chance to get your answers here, and then we have one more question, which is, where is your organization on the journey towards equitable compensation? So you have a few choices here. Haven't started yet, not thinking about it, or we are thinking and talking about it, starting to work on it, actively making changes. We're actually putting those changes into practice right now, or we feel like we're in a good place, we've already done the work, and we're staying where we are. Let's go see who's in the room. So no surprise that most people in the room, from what I can see here, are either starting to work on making changes or actively making changes. It makes sense that you're in the room today. We're very glad to have you here. You also probably have a good amount of both experiences and challenges that we'd love to hear from you as we go along as well. So we'll give just one more minute for people to contribute. All right. Now, I have one more question that I want to ask you, and I'd like you to put your answer in the chat because this is a little bit of a longer question. Some of you said that you did have definitions of equitable compensation. Not everyone does, but how would you define equitable compensation? How would you define equitable compensation? So feel free to, Catherine says equal pay for work of equal value. And there's no one right answer. So work equal pay. What other definitions do you have? Equally takes into account compensable factors, equity and purchasing power. See, now we're getting into some of the nuance here, right? Market driven. So we can already see a number of different factors that come into play in any definition. Good. Please keep them coming. And I hope that you can see already that there is a lot of nuance in our thinking of what equitable compensation is, and that there is no one standard sector definition. So one thing I have learned from our colleagues at Project Fair, who are our partners in this equitable compensation playbook, is the importance of each organization having done the work to have their own definition of what fair means. And so we'll soon see that fairness is a big part of equitable compensation and kind of how that all fits together. But I think if we were to walk away with one thing is, has our organization done the work? And so it's not just kind of Googling the definition and picking one, but to think about what it means for us. So I'm going to go ahead and share with you what this, the equitable playbook and the worksheet. And then we'll get into a discussion of what it all means. Please feel free to use the chat as you go. Let's see where. Okay, so what is this? It's a resource for organizations in the global and humanitarian and development sectors ready to rethink compensation policies and practices. So if you are anywhere from the thinking and talking to the actioning phase, this is a tool that was designed for you in mind. And we did it because we identified a need for a resource to help organizations to navigate the process of reimagining their compensation policies and their practices. So not just their policies, but also their practices, because frankly, the topic kept coming up. Why? Well, we know that there is a tremendous amount of change and transformation that's happening in the sectors. And from what I have seen over the last number of years, compensation is one of those first areas where the rubber meets the road. So it's, yes, change is happening in the world around us, and compensation is one of those areas. It's almost like a symptom of that change that we're seeing coming up again and again. And the reason for that is because compensation impacts every single employee, and for every employee, it's a really visible indicator of value. And so this is one of the reasons why it keeps coming up. And so what all that comes down to is that more and more organizations are finding that traditional approaches to compensation are just no longer fit for purpose. In Humentum, for 18 months, over the course of 18 months, Humentum engaged a working group looking at equitable compensation and the fact that that traditional approaches were no longer fit for purpose. And so the group identified 3 trends that are emerging as significant drivers of that change. And you can see here what those 3 trends are. The first is that there is a greater drive for equity. There's more conversation, there's more awareness, and discussions around equity are percolating down and being woven into the fabric of organizations. And yet at the same time, what we discovered was, we just saw, there is not really a single sector recognized definition for what equitable compensation looks like. So we're all talking about it, but we may be talking past each other sometimes. The second driver is that there were changes in hiring practices. So as traditional headquarters move from location-based spaces to more a functional framework, the needs and the structures and the groupings of staff categories are changing. And so how organizations are recruiting, hiring, and then thus compensating is shifting. And finally, because of all of the changes at a global scale within our sector and outside of our sector, there are changing power dynamics. So there are what employees coming out of in a post-pandemic world, what employees are thinking about in terms of work-life balance, in terms of remuneration, in terms of where and how they want to work is changing, and that impacts compensation. So the goal of the Equitable Compensation Playbook is to help decision makers go through a process that is deliberate, that is thoughtful, and that is intentional to assess how to make the best choice for their organization and for their staff. And we hope that the process includes the principles of fairness and transparency in that process. Now, notice that I didn't say the best choice, period, because there is no single right way to compensate a global workforce fairly and equitably. And that is what makes it such a complex challenge that keeps coming up again and again. So this playbook came together from Humentum and from Project Fair. And it really, this coming together really was a very, very natural partnership. Humentum had spent 18 months, as I mentioned, bringing INGO compensation practitioners and subject matter experts to do a few things. First, we identified why traditional compensation approaches are no longer fit for purpose. The second thing we did was define what we mean by equitable compensation in the first place, because we realized that hadn't been done yet. We then outlined the main approaches that organizations are currently utilizing, and then we developed a process for reflection and assessment to make those insights more actionable. And then at the same time, Project Fair had spent the last 7 or 8 years thinking about what fair reward actually means through research and through co-creation, and had put out a number of resources and tools themselves. And so what we realized was that if you put them all together, it actually could create a really meaningful, useful, practical piece of work to help organizations as they navigate this space. And so that is what we have done. So what actually is equitable compensation? Now, it's important to start with terminology. And I think most of our gatherings going forward really should start with terminology for a few reasons. The first is that words hold and convey power. We can't ignore that with the topic of compensation, because it is so strongly associated with people's livelihoods and with their value, their sense of value, that it's personal and it's emotional, as well as practical and technical. And so words hold value, words hold power. And so we need to start there. The second thing is, because this is a technical topic, it's all too easy to miscommunicate. If we are to be inconsistent with our language, or we're unclear about our language, oftentimes we use the same words to mean different things. And so it's important to start by talking about the words that we use. And so what terms do people use, and how does it all fit together? The terms that you use in your organization may look slightly different, but for the purposes of this playbook and for the purposes of today's space, equitable compensation is one essential piece of a fair total reward package. And so how you can see here is, when we talk about compensation, we're really talking about the financial payments given to an employee. And when we talk about reward, it's the full package of their financial and non-financial payments. The definition here, I want to call your attention to some of these definitions. The Humentum Working Group definition of equitable compensation says that it's providing staff with compensation in a way that is comparatively fair, consistently applied, and transparently communicated. And so those 3 principles were things that we fell back on and leaned back on time and time again as we were doing our work. We used it really as a touchstone. The definition of fair reward comes from Project Fair. And so Ishbel will explain it a little bit more in a minute, but what it means is providing staff with a full reward package that takes into consideration 5 principles. So ethical reward, equity, transparency, sustainability, and compliance and risk. And then the other key point that I would like to highlight around language is that it's really is the importance of developing a thoughtful philosophy on fairness. So each organization to do that. And in order and to communicate it clearly and to implement it in both policy and in practice, because consistency really can't be overstated. None of these things can be overstated. Individual definitions of fairness are going to vary based on personal experience, based on cultural background. And so it's easy to assume, to misinterpret, and to miscommunicate. And that's why having done the work on what you mean by what you say and making sure that that's transparently communicated is so, so important. All right, Ishbel, I'd like to turn it over to you if you don't mind, and feel free to introduce yourself and Project Fair to talk about these fair reward principles and standards.
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Kim. It's great to be here today to talk about this really exciting resource that we've developed alongside Humentum, and just great to see so many people in the room today. I'm Ishbel McWar-Herman. I'm the director of Project Fair, which is based out of the University of Edinburgh. And Project Fair has been going on now for, gosh, we've been studying fair pay for at least 15 years, trying to understand what does this look like within the aid and development sector? How do we create fair pay? What does fair pay even mean? And so when Kim came to us to talk about the resource that was being developed by the working group, we were really excited because the opportunity to kind of share what we've discovered through our own research and to bring that together with Humentum's own expertise as well. When we initially started this process, we were really keen to identify, the best way to pay people. How do you find that one kind of gold standard for paying people? And what we realized quite quickly was actually there is no one particular way that we can do this optimally. So we put together a working group ourselves. This was 25 organizations came together, and we worked very hard over a period of about 6 to 9 months to identify these 5 principles, which we decided would be the most important things to work towards as a sector for deciding what fair pay would be. Now, each of these 5 principles, you can see them there on the slide, they have standards that sit underneath them that help to kind of operationalize them, help to make them real. The idea behind the principles and standards is that they're aspirational. So this is not saying this is what everybody is doing, but we're saying this is what we would all like to be doing. In a perfect world, we want to work towards a situation where we have all of these principles in place within our reward system. And so by kind of coming together as a sector and agreeing to uphold these principles, we can move the sector towards a situation where we have fairer pay overall. Is that okay, Kim?
That's perfect. And I'm going to ask you one more question, because what I'd like to do now is, as part of this playbook, we put together 2 tools to help you all on your journey. And the first tool is Project Fair. So if you want to talk through that as well, Ishbel.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. So as I said, in our earlier research, so this is kind of, around 2010, we were looking at how do we actually decide what fair pay looks like? And we had this hunch that perhaps organizations in similar kind of areas of work or of similar sizes and similar spaces within the kind of global geography, that they might be using similar approaches to pay. What we found through our research was that actually that wasn't what was driving these differences in how people pay their staff. And we identified these 5 key strategic considerations that really underpin the way that organizations were choosing to structure their reward. So you can see those key strategic considerations there on the slide. And these are all specific to your organization, right? So it's not something that somebody else can define for you. It's as an organization, you need to come together and make decisions about what you want, what you're doing currently, and what you want for your organization for the future. So the first key consideration is around, do you want to use globally mobile employees? Why do you want to use globally mobile employees? In what ways do you want to use them? Short-term, long-term, all of those kinds of questions are really crucial to think about really strategically. So not just because you've always had expat staff or you've always had globally mobile staff, but why? Why do you want to use them? Secondly, thinking about localization. So many organizations now are shifting the power, trying to move to a more localized approach. What is your organization's perspective on that? How feasible is that? it's just a really important thing to be kind of teasing out and explicitly addressing. The third area is really around total reward package. So it's saying it's not just about pay, okay? It's also about the whole package, what everybody is being offered in terms of the financial aspects, the cash components, but also things like development opportunities, the reputation of the organization, the things that draw people into your organization. You need to think holistically about that. The fourth one is thinking about the market from which you're drawing employees. So where are you trying to recruit people? Are you looking for highly technical staff? So being really aware of that, which most of you will be already if you're working in this sector, but just realizing what it is that, where it is that you need to go to get people. And then thinking about the structure, the decision-making structure within your organization. How centralized or decentralized is it? That will impact on how you can roll out change within your organization, and how feasible that change might be as well. So really altogether, these kind of 5 key strategic considerations are a starting point for your organization. And we've developed this quiz, which there's a link to it there, which will help you to start to think through this, and maybe give you some pointers about where you can go next as you start to think about changing your pay.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So there's one tool to get you started as you think about this process. The second tool is a worksheet and a process and a set of frameworks that the Humentum Compensation Working Group developed over the course of about a year. And really what it is, it's a process to help you build a clear picture of what your current practices are, to assess if it's fit for purpose, and then to identify areas for growth and change. And when you lay out the process like that, it sounds relatively simple, but as most of you know, the actual going through and having the discussions and doing the thinking and the work can be quite complex. So I am actually going to share the tool itself so that we can walk through it, and then we'll open it up to the little panel group, and we'll talk about what it all means. So when you download, and we will share with this link, so when you download the worksheet, the workbook, you will, on the very first tab, you'll see a set of instructions, and there are 4 steps for you to walk through. The first step is to think about categorizing your employees. The second step is to identify your compensation approach. The third is to analyze that approach. And then the fourth is to reimagine what's possible. What would you change and what would you keep? We have a tab here that talks about the terminology, some of which we just walked through in the actual playbook. And there's some other example definitions of employee categories. Now, this may not be exactly what you use in your organization, but if you don't have definitions for your employee categories, this is a good starting place to use or adapt or adopt. The 3 approaches that we have laid out here are what we've identified as kind of current practice. So these are 3 big buckets of ways of working that organizations are currently utilizing. And so I will talk at a very high level, and then I'll ask our subject matter experts in the room to expand upon it in just a moment. But the very first approach is thinking about it from a location-based approach. So in this approach, jobs are valued based on the local market where the employee works. In the second approach, it's location agnostic, meaning organizations may have different salary scales for their different categories of workers. And then in the third approach, it's role-based. So location is irrelevant and the pay is based solely on the job. Now, as you look across the chart here, you'll see that we've laid out here, there are pros and cons to each. There is no right answer. So for each of these approaches, there are pros, there are cons, and then there are also considerations to be thinking about as you go through this. The worksheet is going to be the thing that helps you get to that process of what we talked about. So in the very first step, you're thinking about how do you categorize your employees? And oftentimes this may not be something that you are thinking about or applying all the time consistently. but what are the big buckets of employee categories that you have? And then what is your definition? So your definition may look different than what we've had and created here as a template. And then where are your employees located? In the second step, this is where you're thinking about, okay, how are, for each of these categories, what is our compensation approach and what is our benefits and allowance approach? And that's where you're drawing from those different options. So it might be that in one employee approach, and we'll look at an example in a minute, the compensation approach is different than for a different employee category. And then the third step is to assess, is it working for us? Why are we doing it in the first place? What was the original intent behind us taking on this approach? What's working and what's not working? Where are we no longer fit for purpose? And then the very fourth step is, what do we want to consider changing? So we have an example here, and we're hoping to collect more examples that we'll add as more and more organizations complete the exercise and contribute. And it just starts to give you a sense of how this works. So what this worksheet really does is both a process and an outcome to get to do an assessment and think, okay, this is what we want to change and this is how we are going to change it. So I'll stop there because that's a very high level overview and we can dig in a little bit in further discussion. And feel free to put your questions in the chat. So what I would like to do now is invite a few of my colleagues to just have a little discussion about it. And so Christian, if you wouldn't mind doing the spotlighting so we can get a sense. I'd like to invite Ishbel and Vivian and Tina and Stephanie to have a discussion. And what I would like to do, folks, is invite you first to introduce yourselves, a little bit about who you are, where you come from, how you were involved in this, and then we will jump right in. So maybe, Ishbel, you introduced yourself already. Maybe we'll do Tina, then Vivian, then Stephanie. That's the order on my screen.
Great, thanks so much, Kim. So my name is Tina Garrett. I just joined about a month ago the International Rescue Committee as their Global Director for Compensation. And previously I was the head of Total Rewards at Population Services International, PSI. So my role, I've been on the Humentum working group since the beginning. So I've been on along for this journey and part of the ongoing conversations about this. And so both been on the Humentum side and also PSI and IRC are both members of Project Fair as well. So contributing to those resources as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Vivian Wong. I'm the Senior Advisor of Compensation at Save the Children US. Prior to joining Save the Children US, I was at IRC. So we've been working closely together with a lot of organizations in the past couple of months with Humentum putting this together. So hopefully you all will find this tool helpful and looking forward to chatting with you all.
Hello, everyone. I am Stephanie Cogdell. I've been with Pathfinder for 3 years now. Prior to Pathfinder, I was Senior Manager of Human Resources at IntraHealth International. I'm currently the Director of Total Rewards and HRS at Pathfinder. And I was a participant at Project Fair and Humentum, and I'm glad we got the two together to I guess Tina and I worked together on both committees and saw that we were doing the same work. And the two great teams came together and put this document together. And we're so excited to have it and hope that you all like it too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so Tina, Vivian, Stephanie, there were a number of people that worked in the Equitable Compensation Working Group over the course of about 18 months. Some of you are probably on this call, so feel free to chime in and jump in, please do. But these three kind of were always there, always pushing, and really got it from the beginning. And so I'm really excited to have all of us here to have a conversation about what it means. My first question right off the top, and I know that I've mentioned this a little bit, is what is best practice when it comes to equitable compensation? There's probably people in the room who are like, just tell me the answer. Can I just do, what are the top 5 things I need to know? What is best practice when it comes to this? Is best practice even a thing? So Ishbel, I know you've been thinking about this for quite a bit. Maybe we'll start with you and then we'll open it up.
Sure thing. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, this is the kind of $1,000,000 question, isn't it? This is what we're all trying to find out. And as I mentioned earlier, I've been researching this for many, many years and unfortunately have not yet found any kind of golden nugget. There's quite a lot of work that needs to be done to try and figure out for your organization what the best, fairest approach is. So I guess two things I'd like to mention here. The first thing is appreciating the importance of this kind of open communication with your employees around deciding what fairness means, because different people, different cultures, different people from different backgrounds have different ideas about what it means to be fair. And so what one of us might assume is kind of a definition of fairness may well be different to others in our organization. So for me, the very first step in moving towards a fairer system is starting that conversation and talking about, what does it mean to you? Is it about equity? Is it about equality? Is it about needs-based approaches, for example? And then the other piece I just wanted to mention was that also came out of our research was that this is a very incremental process. So there is not like, an overnight fix to your pay system. It's about making small shifts towards something which feels fairer for your organization, being more transparent, being clearer about, addressing fairness and having that aspirational goal of moving towards fairness.
Thank you. Vivian, yeah, please, Vivian.
So I agree. There's really no, one size fit all approach. That's best practice. But I think there are certain steps and foundation that maybe organizations can take to, head towards that direction. So one thing I personally think is really helpful is to establish a well-defined job structure globally for your entire organization that covers all your jobs. Because if you think about it, a country director, is that the same job level as the global IT director? No matter where the global IT director sits in which country versus that country director that sits in Senegal, right? So from the top down, every single job should fit within the job structure. So then as you move people around, as you recruit, right, as you transfer people. So I think that is very important as a first foundation to head to a equitable compensation approach.
I think that when we first started going to the meetings, we went with the question or the request that you tell us what was the best practice. And when we found out that you couldn't tell us, that's when we said, okay, well, let's come up with good structure. And we found out one size doesn't fit all. And for example, what Vivian said, one IT director might be the same across the board, or the same grade. When I'm finding out that may not work for Pathfinder. So it is, you have to customize that for each country, because I might have a country that with only 15 employees versus one with 315 employees. So an IT director may not be the same grade or work at the same level. So we have to make sure it's fit for purpose for each organization. But you do have to have a good job and job descriptions in place. And I found that that's one of the things that was lacking with us. Without that in place, we couldn't put good compensation structure in place. And that's what was lacking. And we couldn't move fast enough for our leadership. Everyone was meeting to talk about compensation all around with Humentum, but also our operations directors were also meeting with Humentum to talk about compensation, and they were moving a little bit faster than the compensation people were. So we needed to get something in place because the industry was moving a lot faster. So and get something we can agree on, and that was fit for purpose for the organization, and take back to our leadership that they were happy with, and also engage more of our stakeholders so that we could come together and agree on something that would make the leadership happy.
I agree with everything that's been said. And, I think there may not be a singular best practice out there that we've found, but I would agree that there are some best practices or better practices, things that people are doing that are pushing the envelope and pushing us in the right direction. I think, I always point out, but even as you look through the Equitable Compensation Playbook, you'll see highlights of some of the case studies that have been done, of some of the different organizations that are doing some innovative work and what they're doing. And I think we can look to those for inspiration of what best practices may be that we can, also think about how we could adapt those to our different organizational contexts. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that. And so a couple of things that I heard from all of you was around, I think, communication, transparency, which is not, which is not technically the best practices about compensation in and of itself, but it's just about the process of doing this. How are we being transparent? How are we being collaborative? Stephanie, to your point, how are we not getting ahead of ourselves and making sure that, we're not within departments, we're having the right conversations at the right time, and just being really clear, transparent when at all possible. And I love that you said, we came here, we're looking for an answer, and there wasn't any. So we have to figure it out for ourselves, and what might be best practice at Save the Children may not be best practice at Pathfinder. But what I do recall from those working groups is we learned a whole lot from listening to others' examples and to sharing and figuring out, well, maybe that would work in my organization, or that wouldn't work, but this is why. And now I know why, and learning what all of that meant. So that was really, really helpful for me, at least, just listening and learning as we went. And so, okay, there's no one set of best practices, but there are things that organizations can and should do. I want to talk a little bit about the 3 approaches to the compensation that the compensation group identified. I will share my screen in a minute so that folks can look at it, and we have dropped the link to the workbook so that people can have it and follow along as well. This was not necessarily a straightforward process to get to these approaches. I just want to be transparent and upfront about that. There were several iterations to get us to these 3 approaches, and we may find out in a year's time that there's a 4th approach, and that's okay. So I want to ask you, Tina, Vivian, Stephanie, I'll talk a little bit about the process. Are these the only ones? How do we get here? Where did we struggle, if you can remember? But where did we all really agree and land on these? So Vivian, I think maybe you started these conversations, if I recall.
Right, so I think a couple of other options we threw out on the table would be the mix and match, the hybrids, right? I think, remember that? We had partial approach 1 plus 2, and then somebody said, well, how about 3 and 2, right? So those hybrid approaches certainly could be an option for, certain organizations that they see fit. But yeah, so we think, from our perspective that a lot of the local versus international staff versus headquarter staff, those different populations, that's how we started this conversation, right? How to pay these population appropriately, right? And I think a lot of Humentum questions came up on local currency. Do you pay the local staff in local currency? Do you switch to dollar or hard currency? How do you handle the currency fluctuation? So what is equitable? Do you pay the IT director who traditionally sat in the US, but now because of remote work, because of COVID, they are now sitting in Senegal? What do you pay that global IT director now? So all these conversations went into developing these 3 approaches.
I'll maybe just add, as you look at the approaches and what they are, you'll see that all of them have pros and cons. And so this is what makes it challenging as well. There wasn't one perfect approach that had all pros and no cons.
Right, it's true. And Ishbel, in your other work, how do these approaches resonate? Is this what you're hearing, are these buckets kind of what you're hearing and seeing in your world as well?
I mean, I think there's lots of different perspectives that organizations are taking. We've certainly heard these different approaches. The hybrid approach is something which we also hear about as well. And I think, you know, as I was talking about this kind of incremental approach, we do see that that's where the hybrid often comes in, as organizations identify, well, actually, that's what we'd like to do in the long term, but we can't just jump into that. So let's find ways to shift towards that. So maybe it's, you know, shifting towards a more localized approach, for example. And then how do we do that? Well, maybe we can't remove international salaries completely, but we might try and go to maybe anybody who's moving globally is on a headquarters salary, for example, just in the interim until we can move to a more kind of nationalized, localized perspective. So, I mean, there's lots of different ways that it's being done. I think the value in this document is that it gives some really concrete examples that help people to visualize what different approaches might look like and how they can then be applied within their own organization.
Yep. Okay. Stephanie, did you want to add something?
With us, I think I know that in the conversations that we had, a lot of people agreed to disagree about whether they like one or two, and because especially a lot of the countries that had a tremendous amount of expats and TCNs. With us, we are a global organization that's localized in our with a country-led strategy. So we want ours to be based off the local economy, but we want to put good job descriptions in place with good market data so that the salaries are supported by that. If we have any flaws, if the salaries are too low, if the market data is outdated, then that doesn't work. The localization doesn't work. So if we have good salary structure in place, good market data in place, good job description in place, then that should support that. Then also, if you change your compensation strategy to lead the market or whatnot, then that should also have, you have to position yourself where you want to be in the market. We want to make sure we also support some of the tenets that you were talking about in the beginning when we read over the document that Ishmael talks about with Project Fair about the local economy. We went back and forth with that about that in the different different meetings that we had about how does all of this 1, 2, or 3 impact the local economy. I don't think we all could agree on that, whether it actually impacted that local economy or not, and what that did, because we're not economists, so we could never do the math to understand, to put it together. We know what it's not supposed to do or what it does, or the whole ideal of it, and what we're supposed to do as HR professionals in this world. But if it really does impact the local economy, we don't know, but we'd like to say we're not part of that if it does or not.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And a lot of it, it's important to note that in the room when we were developing this, there was a big diversity within the organizations that were participating in the working group. So some were really large with, you know, and their footprint and their organizational structure was very different than others. And some were really small, and it depended on restricted versus unrestricted funding, and it depended on funders, and it depended on the role, the number, and the strategy around expats, for example. That was a big conversation that came up. Many organizations are actively looking to reduce the number of expats that they have, and some are not. And so how does this factor in? And so I will say that we did, as all the group has mentioned, we did talk about hybrid models quite a bit. And we said, okay, but no one is going to fit into these buckets exactly. But if no one fits into these buckets exactly, then we get back into this like kind of inconsistent chaos situation. And so we did have a little bit of a breakthrough, and I'm going to show you the worksheet. We did have a little bit of a breakthrough when we decided, you know what, when we talk about hybrid, really what we're talking about is we're applying these different approaches to different employee categories differently. So it's not that we're like part approach 1 and part approach 2. It's that it might be that we're applying a location-based approach to our senior leadership, but a different approach to a different category of employees. And that's where the hybrid is. And so if we start to parse that out and pull it out, then it becomes a little bit clearer and a little bit easier to live up to that definition of equitable compensation, which is fair, comparatively fair, transparently communicated, and consistently applied. And it's that consistently applied part that's often so hard. So Tina, I had asked you in advance if you wouldn't mind walking through this, because we did some back and forth on this chart ourselves.
Yeah, so I think, this chart here, as Kim said, there's a blank worksheet, and then this is an example to help give some inspiration to, what we had envisioned, how this tool would be utilized. And so, as Kim has already shared, the first step is really thinking about how do you categorize your employees. There may be organizations out there that take the same approach for all employees, but I'm going to guess most of us do have slightly different total reward packages for different segments of our population. And so it's first just starting, if you don't already have that clearly laid out, to think about how are you segmenting your population? What are those different segments that receive different packages? And so in this example here, we have, starting at the top, senior leaders. Do you provide those in your organization that are a certain level in the organization a different reward package? Do you provide, different executive compensation or not? Are those who are on international assignment, is that a different segment of your population? And do you potentially have them on a different salary structure? Do you provide them different benefits or allowances that maybe other segments of your population don't receive? You scroll down, there's a segment of what we call global services employees, which are those employees that maybe traditionally were at headquarters, but we're seeing are now really are location agnostic. And so those jobs are being done from many locations around the world. Do you compensate those differently than, say, what we called a local employee here, roles that support the operations or projects within a particular country? So these may be your populations. You may have different segments of your population, but the idea was just to think about what are your segments of your population from a compensation perspective that you have different packages for, to describe what those segments are, how you define those. One of the tabs here actually gives you some terminology. So, if you don't have your own terminology yet, you could get some inspiration from that example of the employee classifications. Or you can, create your own, but that would give you a starting point. We did, when you go back to the example worksheet, we have the employee category, the definition of what that means in your organization, and then the typical employee location, because a lot of the conversation we were having is about this idea that, about global pay equity. Now, how do we create compensation when we have a very dispersed workforce? And so what is the typical employee location? We felt was helpful in kind of just framing this and thinking about that. So as you go across, step 2 then is really just documenting current state. So these are your segments. What are those? What do those packages look like? And this is where we got into this whole idea on trying to wrap our mind around. No one could agree to the same compensation approach, or to, they're like, what are the approaches? Because, based on the different employee segments, it wasn't like we all take a location-based approach, right? Because we do for some populations and maybe not for others. And it even came down to, well, for compensation we do, but maybe for some of our benefits, we take a slightly different approach. And so even within the same segment of a population, maybe the approach for different elements of our compensation package could have been different. So you'll see in step 2, just documenting what is your compensation approach, what is your benefits approach, what is your allowance approach. So, and you can see that laid out here in this example. Step 3 is then, okay, so this is our current approach. Like, how are we justifying? What is our rationale for why we take that approach with that population? Do we even have a rationale? Can we justify it to our, can you justify it to yourself why you're taking this approach and why this may be a different approach than with another segment of the population? And, just going through that natural process of what works with this approach and maybe what isn't working so well with this approach. What challenges are you facing with that? And as you, go across that, and you'll see, this example, you have different, senior leadership maybe has different compensation elements than other segments of the population. So, maybe you're justifying that they're a critical group of talent. Maybe turnover creates a significant disruption for the organization for that cadre of staff. There's a very limited talent pool. Maybe you're, feel like you're pulling from a, global market for those roles in some way. So, what's the justification? What's working with that? Maybe that's helping you attract the talent that you need. But maybe that's creating challenges because you're treating that segment of the population differently. So looking through that, and then the fourth step is to say, okay, so, you've looked at how you're justifying it. Do you have a clear justification? What's working, what's not? What do you want to consider? How do you want to reimagine what you might do to push the boundaries to getting towards greater pay equity?
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, the hope is that we can start to compile more examples so that that folks can share and compare, because I do think there's really value in this. And I know there were many in the working group that said, we thought we knew what our approaches were, but even just walking through this really brought up some clarity. And I think, as you said, Tina, do we even have a justification approach, or is this something that was decided 10 years ago and just no one's picked up and looked at it yet in a while?
Yeah, I think like on the surface, it seems like, oh, this is so simple. It's not, but like actually taking the time to sit down and go through this exercise, I think, maybe even starting yourself to do the exercise, then, this can be used as a framework to have a conversation with a group within your organization. I think actually is quite helpful.
Right.
And it is fairly simple.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, walking everyone through that. I see that there's some questions in the chat. I also wanted to mention, which I think kind of ties into that last point, which was, as the group was putting this together, there were a few different goals and purposes in mind. The first was that, there may be, I think this is a useful tool for all organizations. And there may be small and medium-sized organizations who may not have all the resources, all the time, all the bandwidth, et cetera, and just creating a process and a structure to have these conversations could be especially helpful. The second piece that was, I think that the group had, was power in numbers. And for many of you, if you are tasked with doing compensation, there's you have a whole executive team and boards that you are speaking to. And so using this as a communication tool, to communicate what your current state is, where you think you should be going, can be really valuable. And so, as Tina just mentioned, you can do this exercise individually as an individual exercise or as a team, but you could also be doing this in a more broad sense across the organization to bring in other viewpoints and to almost use it as a communication tool. So hopefully there are multiple purposes here.
Yeah. I was saying that I think some of this is really helpful. One of the parts that we came up of equitable compensation was about transparently communicate it, right? And so I think by writing this down, it helps you to understand what you're considering fair. How are you justifying the way you're segmenting that population? Because one of the things I think we all probably, is communicating what we see as fair and how we're setting equitable pay and being able to effectively communicate that to others, because sometimes how we're thinking people should be comparing themselves is not how our employees are comparing themselves, and that disconnect. And if we can't transparently explain that, leads to feelings of inequitable compensation, even if we think that we're paying consistently.
Yeah, I think that's a constant challenge. Stephanie?
I was going to say, I think the best, the most positive thing I got from both the meetings was to understand that I wasn't in it alone, and that my company wasn't the only company having the growing pains or the issues, that there were more people out there having it. So it wasn't unique to Pathfinder, and that there, like Tina was saying, there's resources, or Kim was saying, there's resources out there in our peers in the industry to reach out to. You know, other than data, they're giving us resources to other market companies or consultants that we can use, or what marketing trends were that were going around. But we're not, just to know you're not in it alone.
Definitely not in it alone. Just as an example, for the Humentum members on the call, we have a monthly people and culture roundtable space, and we decided a couple weeks ago that the May topic will be around expats and localization, because it's a hot topic, it's a pain point, and so it's a continuing conversation that everyone is having. And so yes, you are 100% not alone. Ishbel.
Could I jump in? Yeah.
Please.
I wanted to kind of link up what you're talking about with Diane's comment in the chat around just the real challenge here, that we start to kind of compete with one another. And that was, again, something that really came up in our research, was we really need to be doing this together. Like, this is a sector-wide thing that needs to happen. It is not something that individual organizations can address on their own. And so that's why Project Fair really was established, was to try and share best practices, to try and share kind of evidence for what works, what doesn't work, to try and stop this kind of competition that will ultimately only harm the sector and harm the communities with whom we're working. So I guess, you know, Diane, like, your point is so important and so well taken, but key for this discussion is us all being here in the room right now, thinking about this, thinking about how to be really careful about the way that we pay people so that doesn't happen, working together, using the resources from Humentum, the resources from Project Fair, to try and avoid that happening in the future. And I'd just add to that as well, that through Project Fair and the principles and standards, when people become members of Project Fair, they're kind of signing up to those principles and standards. And that in itself, you know, you can use that to kind of show, as an organization, we're committed to fair pay, we're committed to kind of these aspirations where we're doing things, you know, financial stewardship is a really important component of that. It's not just about the pay itself, it's the broader component. So yeah, so I just wanted to kind of point that out, really bring that that point in there, that we have to be doing this together.
Yes, 100%. Thanks for bringing that up. And I know some people are on this call that were on the roundtable call a few weeks ago, and it came up in a similar way, Ishbel, where people were like, can we just do this together? Like, can we all decide and agree and make these decisions together, so that we're not skewing the market, and so that we're not competing against each other? Because if I choose, for example, to make a decision about the status of an expat in with single country, then they're going to leave and they're going to go to another organization, my peer and competitor. And so how do we have these conversations and make these changes within an ecosystem? All of the changes and transformations that we're talking about around powership and local led development are happening within a broader ecosystem. And so more and more, we're going to have to talk with each other and collaborate and co-create together. I wanted to, Tina, please.
Oh, I was just going to add, IRC right now has a project, this global pay review that they're undergoing. And like, one part of the communication that they've sent out around this project is about, and, to meet the goals of that project is really having to find the balance between finding equity, competitiveness, and being good stewards of our resources, and acknowledging that these things are often at odds with one another. And it's a real challenge that we face. We know where we think we should go, but yeah, and for some it's bringing people up, it's also bringing others down, which reduces our competitiveness for certain critical roles in the organization. And even as our funders often want to push us in the right direction too, when it comes down to it, then key personnel decisions or things are not always aligned, even what the direction that we want to go. So it's a very difficult and complex challenge, and I think we have to keep incrementally moving there together. But it is important for us to move there together, because we're putting ourselves at odds with that equity and competitiveness thing at all times when we're not moving together.
Competing internal intrinsic motivations is what I call it. And it's very real. And those three things you just mentioned is a really hard thing to balance. That's a really hard balance. We mentioned a minute ago about the importance of clarity and transparency in how we communicate. There was a question, Sarah asked a question in the chat about how do you actually develop a shared definition of equitable compensation if you're starting from scratch in the first place. Ishmael, I know you have a whole course. I'm just thinking about what fair means. What advice would you have?
This is such a big topic. It's my favorite topic to talk about, but we tend to always kind of assume that there is one common way of talking about fairness, and there just isn't. And that's something that I've been researching kind of from an academic perspective over the past few years, is this understanding that there are lots of different ways to think about it. So, I mean, I can share some of that academic writing with you, but beyond that, it's really about talking to your employees, finding out for them what's important, and coming up with a shared definition, and that definition will feed into all of your HR policies. So it's not just about pay, it's also about it probably feeds into your vision and values as an organization as well. It's all part and parcel of the same thing. So there's not, again, kind of an easy approach. You can't kind of pluck a definition out. It's got to be consultative. It's got to be done really with people everywhere. Taking kind of a DEI perspective on this is really important. There are different perspectives than the dominant kind of majority perspective around what fairness means. And it's really important, particularly for our sector, but for any organization, it's really important to make sure that we're not just assuming that everybody has the same kind of perspective on fairness as we do, as I do sitting in Scotland, or as you do sitting in the US, because there are lots of different ways which have not really been talked about a lot, but are so important. And that's part of that shifting the power discussion as well.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add anything on how you all developed your definitions, or did you already have one?
A little bit. So back in 2021, we had a pretty big comp project that included a definition of our compensation philosophy. And the philosophy covered many different topics, including equity pay. So we went to talk about remote work, right? Because it was during COVID, the height of COVID. So we have, for example, in the US, developed 3 different salary structures for the different geography within the US. And then we also talked about the market, right? Speaking on competitiveness, how do we compare ourselves with non-for-profit and also for-profit? We talked about, how salary is determined. What is the comp ratio that we target? So everything was included as part of that project discussion on compensation philosophy for the organization. So as you all mentioned, it included a lot of focus group discussion with the leadership, many different things that went into it, but it is a lot of work. I'm not going to lie. It will take some work to develop this, holistically, but it's worth it at the end, right? Because then it goes along with transparency, right? Once you develop it with the organization, then you can, share it with the managers. We had manager training. We had, staff training. We have still going through this phase of continuously trying to educate and communicate with our staff on an ongoing basis. To make sure everybody's on the same page. It is a complex topic. I think some of you already mentioned that. So it will take a while and a constant update, communication to make sure everybody understands where we stand as an organization.
Yeah, but it's helpful to have as a guidepost, isn't it? Just to have as a guidepost when you make decisions, but then also, as you say, when you're communicating. All right, there's a question in the chat, and I'm going to try and get it right, but I think you can all see it, both from Mohammed and Amita, about it's about the the non-financial components of reward, right? So how do we practically measure the qualitative or the non-quantitative elements? Organizational reputation, learning and development, professional development, all of that, all of those pieces, all of those elements. How are you accounting for that when we're talking about, especially when we're talking about equity and fairness? It's open to anyone. Who wants to take that one?
I mean, I can, or Stephanie, you go for it.
Oh, so we're in, I'll just start by saying we're in the process of looking at a whole total reward structure at Pathfinder. I think my CHRO is on the call. I'm not sure she's still on or not, but we're looking at our whole total reward structure and trying to see how we can implement a, for lack of words, a benefits, a bonus program or a small rewards recognition program. And then, it's hard with with projects that where it's not allowed. So we're looking at that. We're also looking at how we pay all our countries from one country to another and our equitable benefits and programs like that. Just taking a look overall at all of them globally at once, because we found out some were getting certain benefits, other ones weren't getting that they could get, and looking at to make sure that they could get them, and those were easy wins, low-hanging fruit. And we're also working with a consultant to look at, I should have added that a long time ago, to look at how we pay our local nationals that working on projects versus how we categorize those versus our regional and global employees. And do we need to have a different benefit category for them or not, or how we structure that? So we're looking at that and overall hauling all that, but within a shorter time frame that maybe Vivian was talking about, so that we can have that in place. But I think I'm answering that correctly. I was trying to read through the question, and this is a non-pay structure, but maybe look at a total reward structure to add to the compensatory part of it, and looking at it overall that way.
Thanks.
I think I answered that. If I didn't, let me know.
Yeah, feel free to jump in, folks, with the question. Isabel, did you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, so I put a link to the Water for People case study that we've developed, and they ran a webinar for us last year, and it was really interesting to hear about their approach to trying to monetize some non-financial aspects. Huge amount of work, really difficult for them to kind of actually create, numbers to go with those non-number items. And I suppose a couple of observations that I've had just through the conversations that we've been having is that organizations are maybe picking a handful of things to start with. So again, it's that incremental perspective of, pick a handful of things that you're trying to make consistent across all of your locations, and start from there. And then I guess the second piece is also the complexity of the local context. So even if you take something like annual leave, obviously annual leave is very different in different locations because there are lots of different bank holidays. I mean, that's kind of a simple one. So again, you start to get really, you get caught up in thinking about what happens in a local context. What are the norms in a local context? So in terms of learning and development, maybe there are particular expectations that colleagues have in different countries that we may not have in our own country. So again, it's that kind of conversation that you need to have about what's important, what's valuable to you as an employee in your location, and then starting to kind of weigh up how you compare those across different locations. So really tricky. But again, if you can start with just a few things as a starting point, I think that's quite useful.
So I don't think, again, I think the theme of today is there's no simple answer, but hopefully having the framework, the process, the structure to walk through these challenges and these complexities will start to at least highlight and shine a light on the areas that need deeper discussion and they need to be untangled. Because one of the reasons and the rationale for the start of the building of this tool was that we were having a lot of circular conversations where challenges were weaving into other challenges, and it was hard to kind of take one thread and start to pull it to come up with an answer. And so at least having this process and having a place to kind of map it all out, I think we have found to be helpful. I will say, going back to some of the original conversations that we had in our working group, if you all remember when we were talking about, well, why are these compensation approaches no longer fit for purpose? One of the topics that was kind of a sidelined, because it was like too big for us to even get to, was around communication and transparency. And there's a question here in the comment. Tonya, I love how you wrote this. Once you did all the work, I would be curious to hear you simply communicated these complex concepts and then how the communications were received by employees. There's a lot packed into that one sentence, right? First, how do you take the complex and make it simple? Then how are you transparent about it? And then how is it received? Because just because you think you communicated it in a very logical, clear way does not mean that it's received in a logical, clear way. And we talked in our working group quite a bit about how you're not just communicating down to employees or across, but you're also communicating up and educating up and building the capacity of your leadership and your board, et cetera. So there's a whole lot there. We actually had quite a few debates on, yes, we want to be transparency, but is transparent, but is sometimes being too transparent harmful because you're actually, too much transparency without a lot of the resources, the trainings, et cetera, to back it up can actually cause more harm than good. So opening it up to Stephanie, Vivian, Tina, what's your experience with this?
I think my one recommendation is, like, when you're communicating these things, is have a pilot group that you test your communications on, get feedback. How are they actually being received by the intended audiences? And, before you roll those out is, get inputs. And rolling them out. I do think also, we often like send out an email and put it in a newsletter, post it on SharePoint, right? We all know we don't go look at, our intranets looking for information. Like, so we think we've communicated these things, but you kind of have to weave them into everything, and constantly reiterating. And we have turnover, right? So even people that you've communicated today may be different than the people that you need to communicate to tomorrow. So I think it's just weaving it into all the processes to continue to communicate these things out, versus like just we're going to do a training and then have everyone trained, because that's kind of a point in time thing that then gets lost over time.
I always try to start with my country HR leads, all the HR managers, to make sure, one, that I'm communicating in a clear, consistent way that they understand it, and I'm saying the same thing from country to country, and that they can communicate it to their people that they support, and maybe that it's communicated by the country directors, because with the country-led strategy, we want it to be sent through the country directors or the presidents and not from the global leads, that way. So we're still trying to figure out those nuances of country-led. So sometimes we do revert back to global and centralized headquarters, but try to push it back, because sometimes they do have the desire for it to come from the global HQ, but then we want to push it back out to the country directors. So it's back and forth, but I always vet it with my HRBPs and my country HR leads first.
When we first rolled out the project, we did a lot of heavy communication. We joined several all staff meetings, right, where hundreds of people attended throughout the project, and it wasn't just one time. And then we had manager training as well as office hours. We provided office hours for managers and employees to, come to us with questions. And then we recently did a series of what we call compensation roadshow, where we went to each department to speak with each department individually, and then to talk about key principles. It was just a 10-minute presentation, and then the rest we opened it up to questions. So it goes along with our transparency strategy too. So I think that was pretty well received. some of the steps we took.
Thank you all for that.
I'll just also add, I think a lot of us have the complexity that, if we're talking about our global workforce, we're not even all speaking the same language. So it's, also being able to, these are complex topics when this is your native language that we're speaking in, but then being able to put those into, different languages that we interact with.
Yeah. All of which takes all of the suggestions, which I think are fantastic. Take time, take resources, take brain space, take, all of these different things. And so it is not to minimize any of that, especially for organizations that may be smaller, or maybe, you may be juggling multiple things. It's not to minimize the challenges of any of that. But I think all of those examples are really, really good and helpful. So thank you for that. Okay, there's one other question here in the chat I'm looking at. How do you successfully obtain donor support? If you're looking at doing compensation equity, it could increase the cost of the projects. Have any of you struggled with, let's just say, challenges from your leadership, challenges from your board, challenges from your funders, that you have had to mitigate for or overcome? And the answer may be no. I can also open it up for you on any of you on the call, if this has been a challenge for you too.
I mean, I can kick us off just to say that this is something that we talk about a lot in Project Fair as well, is how do we actually influence donors? And I think, the reality is that donors want fairness. They don't want to they don't want to support systems that undermine kind of fairness within recipient communities, or whatever you want to call them. So a lot of it's about kind of educating them so that they understand what's happening. Why, insisting on having expatriates in particular roles when there are local staff who are really capable and able to do those roles, why that wouldn't be appropriate. So for us at Project Fair, this is a real challenge that we are trying to step up to help to kind of advocate on behalf of INGO sector. But as individual organizations, having those conversations and for donors to hear those conversations coming up, I think can only be helpful. But it's really challenging. It really is.
Yeah, I'll say, this is definitely a challenge that we face. I've only been at IRC now for 4 weeks, but I've had several conversations where, we want to move, a salary structure in a certain direction, or we want to add a certain benefit, or, to move towards more equitable compensation around the globe. And everyone's in agreement, except we can't afford it, to do it for some reason. And funders are resistant to pay for that. So I do think, this is about how do we educate our funders about, and we often hear we're expensive, so how do you, explain to donors, what we're pushing towards, and what we're pushing towards, aligns with a lot of what funders are pushing towards in localization and other things, and helping them to see how what we're doing is actually aligning with their values and objectives as well. And I just think it's lots of education all around.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be that if you had, these are our principles and this is our definition of, and this is where we would like to get to, there's still value in saying, this is what our, this is where we would like to get to, and this is where we can do right now. And this is how we're going to, try to move forward from, from a transparency perspective. I do think there's value in that, because we're all adults and we can all understand that there are restraints in the real world. Hopefully.
I think
all
it
right.
all goes back to these balances that we're all trying to face, which is, we want to be headed in the right direction. We also want to win work. We have these competing things that are just often at odds. And so it's just continuing to fight the good fight. And I think always it feels sometimes a little bit overwhelming, but taking small steps in the right direction. I think over time we do look back and see we've actually made some great progress. So I think I always just try to remind myself, just keep taking steps in the right direction.
Keep taking steps in the right direction. And as Michelle's putting here in the chat, finding your allies and finding people that you can collaborate with, business development, award management, people and culture, all can be working together within an organization, and then finding your peers at other organizations. And there's a lot of going on in the chat about different forums and convening spaces that folks can look at. I'd like to ask all of you one final question, which is, what is your hope for this playbook and tool? How might an organization use the tool? How might they get started? If you were on the call and this is your first exposure to it, what would your piece of advice or your hope for them be? Maybe we'll start with Ishbel and then I'll go around my screen.
Yeah, wow. I mean, great question, Kim. So I think for me, the playbook provides us an opportunity to start this conversation as a sector, to kind of agree on where we're trying to go as a sector. And so as an organization, what I hope you will be thinking about now is, I want to prioritize fairness. How do I do that? What does that mean for my organization? And looking at these different approaches to structuring reward, which of those is actually realistic for my organization to get to? So in the short term, but then also in the longer term. So yeah, I think it's having that conversation and realizing that we're all trying to shift the dial a little bit in the same direction. And so if we can follow some of these kind of frameworks and guidelines, we'll start to move things, which is exciting, I think.
Thank you. All right, Tina.
Yeah, so I mean, I think my hope is that this continues to keep us moving in the right direction. I think there's a lot of momentum around this right now. I mean, everybody I talk to, is struggling with similar challenges. I mean, even as I moved from PSI to IRC, I mean, really like we're having very similar conversations around what we're trying to do, and so. I think also just, it would be great, I think there were a number of people that contributed to this through the working group, but, the case studies that Project Fair has done, I think people adding to examples for this playbook over time, like helps, while there's not one size fits all answer that we can just grab what somebody else is doing and apply it. It gives us inspiration, and I think helps us, think about all moving in a, where everyone's moving. I know one of the biggest questions I always get is, what is everyone else doing? Is this going to keep us competitive, right? So it is helpful. And I think, continuing to work with, I saw somebody, asked a question about survey sources and stuff. I think continuing to work with our vendors to get this, good data too is so important.
Yep. Stephanie.
I think it's a good resource to use, especially since the demographics of the NGO leadership is changing. If you'll notice that we're getting a lot of leadership coming from the for-profit world, and they move a lot faster. They have different ideas about how businesses should run, how people should be paid, and they're not coming from Peace Corps or work inside of the countries or boots on the ground. So you have to be able to relate to them and show them, this is why we do it this way. This is how, I've never worked there, but I've been trained that way. And so, having a tool to use to be able to explain yourself is always useful, and how to relate, because we've never had a guidebook to use or a way to do it. So there's no degree on NGO Compensation 101 or certificate. So this is something good to use, a good resource to have.
Thank you. And Vivian.
Yes, I agree with everyone's comments. I think it is helpful, especially for organizations that do not have a compensation team or a, total rewards SME, right? I do see a lot of questions that come up on the chat, the Humentum chat, and they're repetitive. So people are struggling with the same topics, for a long time. So hopefully this tool will be helpful for a lot of NGOs, especially those who might not have the resources to have a, compensation SME, or even resources to hire a consultant to do this work.
Right. Right. So my call to action would be similar to what everyone has said, but it's just to try it, start having the conversations to try it. My specific call to action would be is if you try it and you are willing to share, this is going to happen. If you're willing to share your example, please share it with us so we can start to compile examples, because the more examples we can have, especially for small, medium, large, all the different, you know, characteristics of an organization. It's just going to help paint a picture of what's happening out there. And it will help more and more people to realize that they are not alone, and that these are the conversations. My hunch is that, you know, this resource is intentionally free. It's open for everyone to use on their own. My hunch is that many people will do that and start the conversations and find it valuable. There may be a few that get in there and you realize, oh gosh, I don't have the bandwidth, I don't have the internal expertise, I need some help. You might get bogged down in the process. If you find yourself getting to that place, we at Humentum are here. We can help provide support or accompany you along this process that is in place. So just reach out and let us know. But also continue to have the conversations. Humentum Connect, the People and Culture Roundtable, the Project Fair Reward and DEI forums. There are many places and convening spaces for people to continue to have these conversations and say, I'm trying this forum, it's not working, this is where I'm getting stuck. Find a partner or someone who can help you through all of those spaces. So that would be my hope and my call to action for all of you. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for coming. We will send around the link for the compensation playbook. You can find right here. We'll send it around in a follow-up email as well as this recording. I truly cannot say thank you enough to all of the folks here on this panel and everyone else who worked in the working group. Project Fair has just been a joy to work with, and I love seeing all the synergies even in the chats of what folks need and what we have, and I'm sure there will be ways to continue to work together. And then everyone who donated their time in the working group, including Tina, Vivia, Stephanie, and then others on the call who I know were there. Hours and weeks and months of coming together and hashing it out and co-creating something that we didn't know it was going to look like this at the start. And I'm really, really proud of it. And I hopefully hope folks think that it's useful, helpful. Provide feedback. Let us know how it goes. If there are things we can tweak, we will do our best. And go out there and think about how to make the world a better, more fair and equitable place. So thank you for that. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much.